Daniel Naroditsky is a regular chess commentator on chess.com. He's also a longtime bullet chess rival of Alireza Firouzja. In fact, Daniel Naroditsky is about as good as you can be at bullet, maybe this side of Magnus Carlsen. And they happen to be paired, Alireza Firouzja and Daniel Naroditsky, in the most recent titled Tuesday. And as you see in the ratings below, Daniel Naroditsky's online blitz rating is actually a little bit higher than Alireza Firouzja, but Alireza was on a tear. Let's see how that game goes. Alireza has white, Daniel Naroditsky has black. E4 is Alireza's opening move, and knight to f6, the Alekhine defense, played by Daniel Naroditsky. The idea is you want white to overextend his center, then to attack it. E5 gaining space, knight d4, d4, d6, c4, knight to b6, and the absolute main line is probably this move, f4, the four pawns attack, but e takes d6 was played by Alireza, and we've seen this move before. Black can take with the c-pawn and create an asymmetrical pawn structure, but Daniel Naroditsky takes with the e-pawn and creates this structure that you see in a French exchange or even in a Petrov's, where you have that one open e-file in the middle of the board that dominates the proceedings. h3. What Alireza is doing, he's playing against this bishop at c8. He wants to take away all of its squares. F5 next. Now, black can play bishop to f5 here. White can just play bishop d3 and has a comfortable space advantage, although it's not a huge advantage. Daniel Naroditsky instead plays bishop to e7, clearing the way for short castling, knight f3 castles, and now bishop to d3. And now the squares are taken away from this c8 bishop. It cannot develop to f5 or g4. And it's interesting to see how Alireza continues doing that throughout the game. Knight to c6, attacking the d4 square. Also, the knight could go to b4, irritating the bishop at d3. Knight to c3, bishop to f6. Now, in most lines of the Alekhine's defense, you'll notice black's main target is this d4 pawn. That's really where black is aiming their forces. They would love to win d4, and already Naroditsky is attacking it twice. After castling, he cannot take the pawn now. If he plays knight d4, then Alireza would respond by taking, and after bishop d4, bishop h7 check. After king takes, queen takes, and white is better here. Black will have to lose a tempo going back. The queen is well centralized, so you can't take the pawn yet. Naroditsky plays rook to e8, b3, defending the c4 pawn. This knight's putting pressure on that pawn. By defending it with a b pawn, he can now move away his d3 bishop. h6. Taking away that bishop h7 check idea in the line we just examined, and now black is threatening to take the pawn on d4, so Alireza defends it with bishop to e3. One idea for black here is knight to b4, hitting that bishop, and when the bishop retreats, to play a5, a4, gaining activity on the queen side. But instead, Naroditsky plays knight to e7, trying to get this bishop activated by supporting it with a move to f5. The knight at e7 supports the bishop to f5. So what does Alireza do? Queen to c2. You still can't develop that bishop to f5. Now d5, played by black, a common idea. The most common response here is c5. And after knight to d7, black will develop around this d4 pawn, maybe play knight f8, e6. The knight at e7 goes to c6, and you have the bishop and two knights attacking d4. That's a common idea. So what Alireza does instead is he plays a4, threatening to irritate the knight with a5. So black plays a5 first. To prevent that, rook f to e1, c6, strengthening d5. And now c5 is played. Since this c6 square is taken away, the knight at e7 can't go there anymore. So that makes it harder to pressure d4. So now the knight can move back to d7. Bishop to f4, a more active diagonal. Knight to f8 can come into e6. Then bishop to e5. First of all, he's trading off his bad bishop because the central pawns are on dark squares. And he's also removing one of the pieces black was using to pressure d4. So bishop takes, knight takes, bishop to e6, rook to e2. We've got one open file. He's preparing to double on it. f6, hitting the knight. It takes away the e5 square for the knight, but it's a very committal decision. One of the problems black has after knight to f3 is he has these weak light squares in the position, and particularly e6 is a sensitive square for black, and Alireza is going to be able to put some pressure on that e6 square. The bishop moves to f7, rook a to e1, queen to d7, and now knight to h4, targeting the g6 and f5 squares, these weak light squares. Alireza just wants to put as much pressure on those squares as possible, and hopefully something will break in black's position. Knight to e6, hitting d4. First, he plays bishop to h7 check. Computers show that knight to f5 was actually a decent move here after knight takes, bishop takes, and there's a pin on the knight at e6. But bishop h7 check, and here king to h8 was probably the best move. The bishop can come back to f5 and pin, and after that. But instead, Daniel Naroditsky plays the king to f8. It makes some sense. He's staying in contact with this rook in case there are any threats down the e-file, but the king is a little bit more exposed on f8 is the problem. Knight to f5, jumping into that nice square. Knight takes, bishop takes, and we have a pin on the e6 square, which we talked about was going to be a vulnerable point in black's position. Rook to e7, perhaps hoping to double and protect that knight. Now queen to d2. Black is tied down here, and what white wants to do is put so much pressure on e6 that this rook on a8 is forced to defend it, and then the queen can eat the a5 pawn. So that's basically the idea. Pressurize e6 so the rook has to move away and then take a5. Rook a to e8. Rook to e3. He's also threatening to triple here. Queen to e2. Queen to c7. Steps out of the pin of this bishop on f5. Now knight to e2. This knight on c3 was white's worst placed piece, so now he seeks a better location for it. Knight to e2, the idea can go to g3 and maybe land on some of these light squares here. Knight to f4 and knight to g3. f5 would be the best landing spot for this knight. It really affects the play a lot from f5. g6 is played by Daniel Naroditsky. Obviously, that makes his kingside pawns very fragile, and the h6 pawn in particular is now a target, but it does keep pieces out of f5. A double-edged move, probably not a bad one. Risky, though. Rook takes e7, rook takes. And here, black would love to take with the queen to keep that king safe and control that e-file. The only problem, it would hang his knight. So because of that, he's forced to take with the king, which I think was Alireza's idea when he exchanged on e7. It's a bit uncomfortable for black. And now Alireza plays a really beautiful move. Bishop c8, targeting that b7 pawn, and black cannot take it because then queen takes f4. He threatens the h6 pawn and coming in and causing havoc on the d6 square. The best move for black, as it turns out, was this very beautiful move found by the computers. Knight takes g2. You basically remove the knight as a target, and then after king g2, black can take the bishop at c8, and then queen takes h6. You have even material. White is still better, not by a lot, primarily because the queen and knight form a better combination of pieces than queen and bishop, because the queen and bishop are redundant. The bishop does what the queen already does, but the queen and knight work together very nicely. It's not a huge advantage, but it would have been something of an advantage. Instead, Naroditsky plays the move g5, defending the knight with the pawn, freeing the queen to take the bishop on c8. The problem is it weakens these light squares, particularly the f5 square, which Alireza has wanted this whole time, and he jumps right in. Knight to f5 check. The king moves to f8. So what do you do about this bishop on c8? Well, knight to d6 defends that bishop, and the knight is on the beautiful d6 square. Naroditsky plays b6 to undermine that knight. The bishop comes back to f5, taking on c5 twice, keeping that knight defended, but now the queen aims at a5. So Naroditsky makes a committal decision. He plays the move queen to e7, giving up the pawn at a5. Queen takes a5. Knight to e2 check, king to f1, knight to d4. Now here, Naroditsky has a very nasty threat. This threat of queen to e2 is really serious. If he were allowed to play it, he would actually be completely winning in this position after king g1, queen d1 check, king h2, knight to e2. The threat of queen to g1 mate is basically unstoppable. You could have a few checks, but eventually, you'd have to give up the queen for the knight. And so Firouzja has to deal with this queen to e2 check threat, which is really nasty. So he plays bishop to g4 to cover the e2 square. h5 tries to kick the bishop away. Queen to a8 check. King g7 was maybe the better response here. After queen c8, hg4, queen g4. He looks like he's down a piece, but he's threatening the knight, and if the knight moves, the knight to f5 would fork the king and the queen. But instead, bishop to e8 was played by Daniel Naroditsky, and Firouzja makes a decision here. He decides to liquidate some of the pieces and get a minor piece ending. So queen e8 check, queen takes, knight takes. Here, the king can take, but then bishop h5 check, and white is in very good shape. So he goes ahead and takes the bishop first. Then the knight takes on f6. And we can see after knight b3, knight g4, Firouzja is up 2 pawns. Naroditsky does have a passed pawn on the d file, but Firouzja has pawns on both sides of the board. Going to be very hard to stop. Knight takes c5, a5, king e7, knight to e5, aiming at c6, king d6, but that allows knight to f7 check, forking the king and the pawn at g5, king e6, knight takes with check, king f5. Knight f7, knight to a6, blockading this a5 pawn. Knight to d8, c5. So black has the c5 and d5 pawns. What Alireza needs to do is find a way to blockade and stop those. If he can, then he will clearly be winning with pawns on both sides of the board. So he moves the king in to help slow those pawns down. c4, knight to c6, controlling d4 and keeping the king out of e5. King goes to e6, knight to d4 check, king e5, king e3. The pawn moves to c3, but then f4 check, king d6, and king to d3. And now that Alireza had stopped all of black's counterplay in this position, Daniel Naroditsky resigned. I hope you enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog.